There was this very long sidewalk that went from our back door all the way across the backyard to the alley. And the alley was where the trash cans were. And back in that day, the trash was still burned. I remember wanting to take out the garbage because I like to set the trash on fire. I especially like to burn giant cardboard boxes because the flames just sort of crept up the sides until the whole thing collapsed. Which leads me to think that most little boys are just budding pyromaniacs anyway. My favorite chore was to take out the trash. My least favorite chore was also involving that long sidewalk from the back door to the alley. About twice a month, my mother would send me out there to pull the weeds that grew up alongside the sidewalk. There was no electric weed whacker. There were no hand clippers. There were not even any garden gloves, just my two bare hands. And I hated that job. I hated those weeds. Those weeds were strong and pervasive. And no matter how many times my mother sent me out there to pull them, guess what? They always grew back. Much later, when I lived in my own parsonage in Cleveland, Ohio, I took on this battle of the weeds for myself. Truth is, back then I really didn't have much of a life, so I just poured everything I had into my yard. I had one of those picture-perfect suburban yards. I learned from my neighbors how best to kill weeds. They taught me how to dig underneath a dandelion until you pulled it out whole, roots and all. They showed me how to lay plastic down on a flower bed before you put any of the topsoil down, so that your flowers would grow up, but everything under the plastic would die. Those flower beds looked nice and they were weed-free. Lots of Americans seem to have a thing about weeds. You notice that? When you get out of New York City, people out there in the rest of the country, they have a thing about weeds. They just hate them. It makes me wonder if we don't hate them so much because they mess up our perfect plans. They're unruly. They grow where they want, how they want, as often as they want. We love order, and weeds represent for us those things we can't control. So what do? We dump chemicals on the ground. We cover the earth with plastic. We conquer nature, or so we think. We impose order on this world, or so we think. It makes us feel like we have a little bit of control to kill the weeds. Over the course of the summer, the lectionary has us reading the parables of Jesus. These wonderful stories are pictures. They're snippets of the reign of God. These Jesus stories are purposefully designed to involve your imagination, my imagination, and they are designed in such a way so that you and I will draw our own conclusions based on our own life experiences, and that makes them very personal. Theologian John Dominic Crossan says that by teaching in parables, Jesus himself was open to interpretation. That's why the people said of him, he doesn't teach like the scribes and the Pharisees. He teaches different. Jesus told stories. People drew their own conclusions. Jesus knew that the truth, as seen through the own experience of our lives, that kind of truth, integrated in our lives, has the power to actually change us. The parable of the mustard seed is one of Jesus' best-known stories. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of all the shrubs, and it becomes a tree, so that all the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." you've ever held a mustard seed, and Pastor Winkler has a whole jar of them in his office downstairs. If you've ever held one, you know how small it is. They're tiny. They're easily lost. They're hard to see. Jesus said that a mustard seed is a picture of the kingdom of God. God's reign often has a tiny beginning, almost imperceptible. But if you water it well and are patient enough to hang it around until it grows, you'll be delighted by something completely unexpected. With this parable, and many of us have grown up with it, we have been taught, and rightly so, not to disparage even the smallest act of kindness. We have been taught, and rightly so, to celebrate every victory of justice over oppression, like all those people in New York State who are able to be married today. We have been taught, and rightly so, that from the smallest beginnings, goodness and love and peace can flourish. Even in the bloody ground of Norway, those things can still grow. That's how we interpret it. That's how we've been taught to interpret it. But the real question for the parables of Jesus is, how did those first people hear it? What did it mean to them? What did they hear? What was it in their lives that they mixed with this truth and found something greater? Well, first of all, for the people in the crowd that day who listened to Jesus for the first time tell this story, mustard seeds were weeds. Weeds. Completely undesirable for any serious garden. And although mustard plants had their culinary and medicinal purposes in Jesus' day, they were well known and disliked for taking over the entire garden. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, who was alive during the life of Jesus, wrote, "Mustard seeds grow entirely wild, though they improve when they are transplanted. But on the other hand, when it has once been sown, it is scarcely possible to get the place free of it. For wherever the seeds fall, it germinates at once." So mustard seeds grew weeds. Weeds are a picture of the reign of God. Second, the people in the crowd that day would have also known that there was a biblical prohibition against mixing different kinds of plants in a garden. Leviticus 19:19 states, "You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seeds. You shall not put on a garment made of two different kinds of materials." They knew that. And yet mustard seeds fall wherever they will and grow wherever they will. More interesting still, Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and purposefully planted, cross-pollinated, put it in the place it wasn't supposed to be. So this breaking of the Levitical law was not an accident of the seed blowing in the wind and landing someplace else. It was a purposeful act of disobedience. Breaking rules about separation and order is one of the rules in the kingdom of God. And if that was not enough to electrify the crowd that day and to honk some of them off, Jesus introduced birds to the picture. Squawking, messy birds. And if you've ever planted a garden, you know what birds can do to it. Additionally, in Hebrew scriptures, birds are often referred to as the Gentiles, the outsiders, those who are unclean. God's reign on this earth wrote, "All the birds of the air made their nest in its boughs. Under its branches, all the animals of the field gave birth to their young, and in its shade, all of the nations dwell." So the kingdom of God is like a weed, undesirable to many people, growing where it will. We try to segregate it out of our gardens, but it grows anyway. It attracts all sorts of undesirables. The birds come to nest in its branches. And according to Jesus, that's a beautiful thing. That's the way it's supposed to be. Sometimes I understand that and live that out, and sometimes I don't. A few years ago now, I was in the office downstairs when I was told that I had a phone call from a former parishioner in one of my previous churches. Typically, this would have delighted me, but to tell you the truth, I really didn't want to talk to this one. She represented that part of my life that I don't like to think about very often. You see, she was calling me from that church that finally pushed me right out the door and right out of ministry for 10 years. There was a lot of hurt, and a lot of unfairness, and a lot of sadness, and I was angry. And I had gotten on with the business of planting a new garden here, an orderly garden, where I tried to forget all the dirty birds of that other parish. When I was told who it was that was waiting to speak to me, I thought I handled it quite well. I cursed, and then I took the call. It turns out that church at that time was compiling a history, and they wanted me to remind them about where I was now, about my education, blah, 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 blah. After some polite, orderly chit-chat, she gave me her email address, and I promised to respond to the questions she had posed. I did that, as I usually do right away, so I can get it off my plate, so I don't have to think about it anymore, especially not that. But a few hours later, a new email arrived in my inbox. It was from her. Oh God, I sighed. And I opened it. She thanked me for responding so quickly. Then she ran through a list of people who sent me their love through her. And then she closed with the shocking salutation, "Love, Barbara." Now I would have been tempted to simply dismiss all of this, to keep that protective covering over my heart, had it not been for her peculiar postscript. She simply wrote, "Lucky Broadway UCC." And that took me by complete surprise because, quite frankly, I had always thought of Barbara as being one of those who was happy to see me go, eager to plow under my garden just as soon as I was out of town. But apparently, mustard seeds are hardier than that. They are not so easily disturbed by the plows of cruelty or injustice or neglect. The seeds of the kingdom, they lay there waiting to sprout, waiting to grow their roots and to push up through the dirt and to reach toward the sky. And somehow, during the time I served that church, something I said or did just happened to plant a seed. And it grew. And the birds of the air came. All different kinds, messy, squawking and colorful and wonderful. They made their nests there. And as I pondered the words that allowed my right to being angry to subside, let my bitterness go, I realized that one of those dirty birds was me. Happy at last to land, rest in the shade of the kingdom of God. whose name is blessed